Now we're one down, you probably noticed. I'm sorry, we all promised you Steve Parish, the chairman of Crystal Palace Football Club, but unfortunately he texted me late last night to say he'd not been able to get back from Spain on time. And given that I now know his negotiating tactics for buying flight tickets, I happened to bump into him on his way back from Cannes, and he was delighted to show me his ticket, his BA app, showing me how much he'd paid for his ticket. I challenge anybody to have paid less than he paid for his ticket. So he's clearly a good businessman, a good negotiator. He'd paid £25 for his ticket back on the Saturday morning from Cannes, so prime time, because he'd bought it 3 hours before the flight. So, you know, that's when he was saying, why do you want me on my panel? And I said, that's why I want you on my panel, because you know how to negotiate.
Yeah.
But that might... And Alan has stolen my lines because last night when he spoke to me and I said, that's why you're stuck in Spain. And I'll have the last laugh on you. But Alan, you're absolutely right. He got what he negotiated, and sometimes it blows up like that. But I asked him for one piece of advice, which I'll share with you at the end of the panel session, because it took me by surprise. It wasn't actually the advice that I thought he might have given us, but it was insightful and interesting. So let me welcome on stage, forgive me, I'm going to be on and off with my glasses, Sarah. We've got Sarah Baumann, Deputy CEO of Leo Burnett Group, who is also on the IPA Talent Group. So I'm going to be pushing Sarah for some insights and some feeders on how a lot of what we've heard about this morning and what commerciality means affects our people and what we need to be doing to help support them, coach them, train them, and enable them to succeed. Sera Miller, CEO of Material Group, based in Scotland, very recently personally moved down to be with us here in the south, but also on the IPA Effectiveness Group. And I'm going to be pushing Sarah in terms of how the value group can really help us, because we've heard a lot today about value and our need to articulate better the value that we bring to our clients, and maybe that is one of the most important pillars in being able to price better. Paul Knight, Chief Operating Officer at OMD, who I know has implemented a pricing council in the business and has been working closely with Tim. So I'm really keen to hear and ask Paul to share with us what that process has been like, how he's got that up and running, and how it's operating and working, and the differences.
Tim's sitting here, so I can't say rubbish.
You can't say rubbish, can you? Yeah. He's taking notes. He'll be giving you your lines. And finally, Marc Nohr, who's a CEO of an independent agency, sold a business and set up and is an old owner of obviously Fold7, but I'm really interested in an owner perspective and to see whether it's different to a network or an otherwise owned business in terms of some of the behaviours. Because when I'm sort of looking to sum up a little bit today, I felt that everything everybody had spoken about was really directing us to behave differently. And that is clearly a choice that we all have. And behaving differently, doing things differently, is all about taking personal responsibility. So, Paul, let's start with you. I'm really curious about the process that you went through in setting up that pricing council. Can you share with us what that journey was like?
I mean, actually, it started for us probably 2 years ago, where everything that everyone said this year and last year, we realised we had to sort of set our own agenda commercially. So we did it within our agency. We set up a all-agency training programme, which is still ongoing now, where we went through different elements from the basics to how, being honest with our people about how the agency makes money and the flow of money, all the way up to how we can improve shareholder value, which is obviously, you know, the strategic end of sort of trading. And the pricing council was a sort of natural extension in the last 6 to 12 months of that, where we introduced a sort of pricing into the centre of the agency as a core strategic decision. Now, from the training that we'd done up until the point where we'd introduced the pricing council, The real aim of it all was to improve everyone in our agency's commercial confidence and get everyone more proactively thinking about commerciality. And thankfully the stats showed that we had a 30% improvement in how everyone felt commercially. So we're certainly taking the agency on the journey with us, but as Tim suggested earlier, we've now sort of focused on 6 to 8 people setting up that core pricing council where we can now make some strategic pricing decisions for the agency.
Who's on that council? You know, is it typically a finance community or is it a real mix of people in the business?
Yeah, it's a mix. I can't remember whether Tim mentioned it there, but it needs to be people who are clearly passionate about commerciality and pricing, but also, you know, there's almost 400 people at our agency, so it needs to be 6 to 8 people who have a very good understanding of what the agency can offer. Yeah. Because a lot of what we're looking at is the services that we offer, whether they're packaged currently in the right way or need to be repackaged in a different way, and then the value that those services can bring to our clients. So they need to understand the range or the breadth of what our agency can offer. They need to be pretty senior, because I think that's an important thing. And clearly it's not just the 6 or 8 people who sit on that council. Those people will then speak to a number of different people as we work through the work streams. I guess the other key thing to say is this isn't an overnight fix. You know, we've sort of been on this journey for 2 years, and the pricing council will maybe be another 1 to 2 years, but it's something that we fundamentally believe is important to, as everyone said this morning, to build greater confidence in our offer and the way we approach our clients and position ourselves to our clients.
And are you already starting to see green shoots or things happen that wouldn't have happened 2 years ago in a positive sense?
Yeah, I mean, certainly even within the last 6 months, without going into the sort of details, we've tested some of the principles on a number of clients, and what we're discussing as part of the pricing council is coming true. You know, you don't necessarily have to go in with one option. I think a big learning from what I've found is go in with different options, and they're definitely working with our clients, because then the power is in the client's hand to make a decision across a range of very good options, rather than just how we would historically do it, which is obviously what we were just talking about, you know, your poles apart in terms of what a client's after. If you look at options and present options, it's a lot more powerful, and it is working. It feels like it's working.
Brilliant.
And certainly for the work that we're doing, the confidence building that we're doing, people are a lot more confident to have those conversations, whereas in the past they wouldn't be.
Cool. Sarah, moving on to the people aspect of this, how has your experience been of, if you like, the creative community? There is a perception or a myth, certainly that I've experienced, that, oh, the creatives will be bored by all of this stuff, you know, commerciality, the lights will go off. In your experience in Leo Burnett's and in other agencies, what do you think we need to do to ensure our talent are equipped, but also that our creative community are embracing this, or is that an issue that's not true at all?
I think it's changed an awful lot since I started working, and certainly when I joined a big agency and, you know, you're sort of working in the comfort of big retained pieces of business. I mean, I think it took me about probably 3 years to ask anyone, oh, how are we actually getting paid and how does it work? And that has really changed now. I think, you know, from the very, very start, you know, whether they're account execs, junior planners, and even sort of creatives as well, are very, very keen to understand the dynamics of the business. And what we're trying to do is just make that part of the everyday conversation. So people understand and people have a shared ownership of the work that they do and how that contributes to, you know, our profitability, our reputation, and all of those things which actually help us commercially. And then I think there are quite a few things that we're trying to do to sort of formalise those processes and those discussions within the agency. So twice a year, for example, we have quite formal account strategy reviews, which is a sort of a check of you know, sort of the quality of creative work, the relationship, you know, potential opportunities and issues, and of course the commercials as well. And that is very much, you know, we see that as a shared responsibility between the business lead, the creative director and the planning director on each business as well. And I think, you know, in sort of my experience recently, and I don't think our agency is unique in this, but, you know, creatives are, you know, absolutely, you know, commercially savvy, commercially interested, and really, really smart and helpful at coming up with, you know, ways to drive kind of, you know, better business and better value for our clients as well, because ultimately that's what they're charged with doing for our clients. They are finding solutions to grow their business. So of course, you know, they're also very, very helpful when it comes to our own.
So it sounds like you've done a lot of that through putting processes in place. But have you done anything about training the people, or is there any formal program of training and development?
Absolutely, because I think, you know, training is totally integral, and I sort of been remembering with fondness when I went on Scott work all those years ago when we could afford to send people down to Bournemouth for kind of 3 days. And
negotiating going on here.
Yeah, we haven't been brave enough to negotiate ever since, but but no, we do. And I think, and you know, what again, the surprising thing is actually how successful and how positive that training's been received. We recently ran a kind of sort of mini MBA in a day over a couple of sessions with our sort of senior account directors, and they came out sort of bouncing off the walls, saying that's sort of the best, most interesting, exciting training they've done for kind of, you know, a very long time, which I hope doesn't reflect badly on the rest of our training, but I think it's just an indication of actually, you know, there is a genuine desire to understand how it all works and how they can be involved. And, you know, I think, you know, we're great believers in everybody from sort of the day they walk in, you know, should be learning about, you know, sort of how their account functions, how it works, and, you know, do formal training like the commercial certificate and other such things as well.
Cool. Thank you. Now, Sarah, effectiveness. You and I have had many a long evenings talk about value and how do you define value, how do you measure value, and it's still something that's quite fluid and ambiguous in our business, but I do believe if we could define value better, we might be able to lead the conversation with our clients in a more imaginative and powerful way. How do you feel the effectiveness group can help the commerciality of our business get strengthened by talking more about value?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we talk about a lot. So there's a line in the pricing guide actually that refers to, you know, we know the value of what we do. And I would actually challenge us to stop and think about that a little bit, because you opened with it this morning. There's an awareness of evidence. So the link between creativity and effectiveness, or any number of different points. There's an awareness of that evidence. However, that awareness doesn't necessarily translate to understanding, and it doesn't necessarily translate to application. And in particular, from an agency perspective, when it comes to value-based pricing, it doesn't translate to an articulation of that value. So when we look at some of the challenges that we're facing, so just picking on one from, you know, that's a very kind of current topic for us in the effectiveness leadership group, and that's short-termism. So if we look at the outputs of the recent Media and Focus report, Les and Peter's most recent work, we think about short-termism, and we think about a couple of things that are really quite dangerous when we think about value-based pricing. So one, we think about this sweet spot between a balance in kind of spend. So we think about the 60-40 ratio that Les and Peter have identified as kind of the ideal target. 60% being on brand building, 40% being on activation. And that actually, that split has now kind of moved much more towards 50-50. Then when we think about that activation and that very short-term ROI-driven spend and activity, but we think about where we actually build the most value, being in the long term, the key challenge then becomes how do we have the conversation about proving the value of what we do 3 years from now, when everyone around the table is incentivized on the next quarter or a very short-term ROI metric. Secondly, that CMO is probably not going to be there in 3 years, given the average tenure of that CMO, and indeed CEO is dropping and dropping and dropping. How do we have the conversation about what we can do and what we can achieve from an effectiveness perspective, not an efficiency perspective, which is ROI is an efficiency measure, it's not an effectiveness measure. And there's a really, really significant challenge around that. And the more and more the industry kind of focuses on that short-termism aspect, which is driven by digital in a lot of ways, the conversation about value-based pricing has never been more important, but in a number of ways it's never been more challenging because incentives and pricing around short-term ROI become about quarterly sales blips. They become not about the value that we create. You are then pushed back into the time-sensitive conversation and all of those challenges there. So I think there's a really significant opportunity from an effectiveness community perspective where we can really get involved in this conversation. I'm really happy to be here today to be having this. But I actually think a lot of the challenges that we're facing almost compound some of those pricing issues. And the kind of, when you look at Les and Peter's kind of effectiveness graph, as it were, there's dropping like this and this and this, and 12 times kind of effectiveness with creativity now being 5 times and it going like this. You don't need to be an FD or a CFO to know that if the graph keeps going like this, you know.
But I guess, you know, for me, there's a real overriding theme today that we have to, if you like, stop looking in that rear view mirror because that stuff is behind us. We have to be client-centric or reality-centric, maybe is a better way of putting it, and accept that CMO's tenures are shortening. There is a growing need to deliver in the short term, probably as well as the long term. So as a business, as an industry, we absolutely have to work out how we start to define value in actually multiple ways to enable us to better articulate our proposition in a value-based way. I mean, maybe it's the one area that we haven't covered enough today in terms of how do we do that, what do we do next. No. It's the area that feels to me still the vaguest because we can't wait for history to give us a definition. No. We've got to be able to define value now in a way that a McKinsey and an Accenture would sit and confidently predict, even if it meant that they had to make 10 assumptions, they would make 10 assumptions.
Yeah, and it's one of those great, you know, it's been touched upon slightly today, Richard touched upon it earlier. It's one of the great ironies about the fact that, you know, we don't practice what we preach. We preach customer first, customer experience, customer centric kind of methodologies, thinking and planning. We don't practice that at all. we're obsessed with innovation, but typically that can become skewed towards tools, techniques, which has been touched upon. And again, it's great that it's within the pricing guide actually, because there's a whole section about turning that kind of, whether you call it creativity, problem solving or innovation, and actually focusing that back onto pricing. We have to have that, take that responsibility. The kind of rallying cry of the fact that it's nobody else's responsibility other than our own. Out of anyone, we should have the skills. We understand human behaviour better than anyone, supposedly. We have access to tools and innovation. We have access to best practice examples. We have the network. We are connected within this field, and yet we're not doing any of that. And it's all there for us to kind of to focus on. And I think a lot of what has been talked about today about shifting the mindset. If we think about how do you change culture, so we think about language. I think that's been mentioned in nearly every kind of conversation that's happened today. Whether that's shared language or adapting our language, whether that's about investment, not cost, whether that's about getting better at being able to communicate in the language of risk. So we're not very good at that at all, and helping clients de-risk decisions. All of those kind of conversations, it's all there. It just feels like we're not converting that, and we're not, out of anyone, again, we should understand the connection between language, behaviour and culture. Perception shift and behavioural change is our bread and butter, and yet we're all still here having this conversation today. So,
and you've said just then the word that I've been looking for, which I really haven't heard much today, and I'm going to sort of throw this across to Marc, because I think Marc probably knows how to manage this every day and manages it in a way that maybe those of us that work in different otherwise owned organisations maybe are more apprehensive about managing, which is that whole thing about risk. In a sense, a cost plus or model is a low margin, low risk model, or supposedly it is. And if you want higher returns, you need to be ready to take more risk. So, Marc, do you find running your own agency in an independent, you all own it, you've all got skin in the game, your tools, techniques, your way of managing risk is different? Do you feel independent agencies are more fleet of foot? They're more entrepreneurial when it comes to pricing and value? Do you feel there's a big difference?
So I'm bound to say yes, but that's my bias. And I think that structurally there are just differences, and we're accountable only to ourselves, and we live with the consequences of the decisions that we make. When you're running a network agency, which I've also done, you're accountable to external shareholders and a different kind of sort of authority structure, if you like, and the shareholders may not even be in the building, they may be elsewhere. Having said that, I think the skills are generalizable, and I think that the observations that people are making are true to all of our businesses. I'm fascinated by the kind of technical aspects of negotiation that we're discussing now, and I think that the debate about value is absolutely appropriate. But just sort of two observations as I listened to the debate. I was fascinated by Richard's observations about behavioural biases, the behavioural biases of human beings, but I think we also need to understand a little bit more about our own personal biases, because I think we all have biases in negotiation. I had a father who was the world's most aggressive negotiator. Maybe you know more aggressive people, but I certainly didn't. He used to reduce people to tears. He worked in the Middle East, and he even tried to negotiate in Tesco's with the checkout guy at one point. And I remember thinking, just don't do it. So in my early career, I found that so unbelievably embarrassing that I used to overcompensate and always try and please people in negotiations. So that was a kind of a personal sort of journey for me to try and understand how I sort of overcame that bias. So something about personal biases. And then as passionate as I am that we need to be better at negotiating and recognizing value and doing all the things that I think everyone's spoken about today, I also think we need to take a good, long, hard look at ourselves and look at the product that we're selling. Fundamentally, agencies are, at their worst, flabby, bureaucratic, and not sufficiently focused on how they create value to start with. And though agencies are often quite quick to complain about some of the practices of procurement departments, and believe me, I've been there. In fact, my very next meeting is with one, and I'm now thinking a little bit about how I'm preparing for that meeting right now. I think that we can be a lot more imaginative and creative in the way that we configure our products. So it was quite humbling for me to join an agency, which I did 2 years ago as CEO, that was already financially successful. It was already number one in the kind of Drums independent survey of independent agencies by financial performance. And to see how this agency that actually I wasn't even familiar with, I'd never even encountered it before, had a premium pricing strategy that employed people that were more experienced, and were very, very confident about the product that they were selling and had clients who were prepared to pay. And these were big global clients with aggressive procurement departments, and were very focused on where they were adding value and where they weren't adding value, and making sure that they were charging for the former and not for the latter. To that extent, running your own company means that you can be more agile and fleet of foot because you're unencumbered. Whereas, though not everybody would necessarily want to talk about it, people working in other people's businesses and network businesses are carrying a lot of organisational and bureaucratic drag, some of which they can't do anything about.
I would challenge that, can they not do anything about? Because I think we all, it's a human trait that you accept some of those things as norms, whereas it's the brave, courageous one that actually steps out and says, well, why not? Just do it. I remember sitting on listening to a similar panel a number of years ago with a guy called David Hay, who runs now Brand Futures company in the city. And he was the sole person on the panel that just looked at the room and said, just put your prices up. We're all familiar, hopefully, with the 1% windfall, where if you put your prices up, it's the fastest way to get more profit on the bottom line. And we still sort of default into that defend mindset rather than overtly planning our pricing. And I'm a firm believer that we can do more about it. I mean, Paul, do you find now that Pricing Council is starting to settle that people are beginning to feel more liberated, more empowered, and actually
totally.
there's more they can do than they can't do.
Yeah, totally. But I think Mark's right. You know, you've got to have the right products in the first place,
Yeah.
otherwise you're pushing more uphill.
Yeah.
Let's be honest about it. Procurement will always still see us as one of their biggest costs. So for us as an agency, you know, it's all about that value. And we spoke about this before. It's not just the value you add. It's the additional value that you can add from your nearest competitor.
Yeah.
And that's difficult to quantify and difficult to talk about and articulate. So I think it's, for us, effectiveness is probably one of the key things. You know, I'm thankful that we've had a very successful history at IPA Effectiveness Awards.
Yeah.
And that gives us a bit more permission to talk about, you know, the value that we can add a business because we're making their marketing work more effectively.
Yeah.
And that gives you a license to open up that conversation.
Yeah.
I think the problem that you've got sometimes is, you know, if you asked how we add value to a business and asked that of a procurement person, of a CMO and of a CEO of the same company, you would get very different answers. And I think the only way we can genuinely add value probably is by speaking to the CEO of the shareholders, because invariably procurement will want cost down, marketing will want value up, but it's only really what the CEO, and that's, I think, you know, we've said it before in previous conferences, always have that C-suite conversation, and I genuinely believe that's important, as well as probably getting them all in the same room, because I think, you know, again, tactics and game playing, they will try and have those conversations separately, but I think if you can align it back to Tim's point of scoping out the value up front or scoping out the work up front, I think that gets everyone on a good course.
Now, I'm conscious of time, so I think there are some mics around the room. Is there anybody out there who'd like to ask anyone on the panel a question? I can't believe you're all going to be shy. Are you really all going to be shy? We must have a question on the floor. Here we go. Now we've suddenly got some. Tom.
And I think it's actually very encouraging that the procurement word has it's been mentioned, but it seems to have moved on from let's just blame procurement, which I think is a great progress. But the word I have heard a lot this morning from many of the speakers and also in the panel is the word confidence. And Paul, you mentioned confidence specifically. So it's a bit of a general question, not just to Paul, but to the panel. A lot of confidence underpins a lot of what we've talked about: confidence in pricing, confidence in approaching clients, confidence in negotiation. Where does confidence come from, and how do we measure it? How do we improve it in agencies generally, commercially?
Mark, do you want to take that? Because
Yeah,
I'm
well,
interested in your premium value.
I was talking to Keith about this earlier in the break, because I'm really taken by his notion that we shouldn't view things like confidence as remedial problems, but that in fact we should all work on it, however confident you are. And looking at the whole world of elite sports, which I'm particularly interested in, and the notion that the best people just try to get better. So what can we do about that? I think first of all we've got to recognise that it's a skill, that it's a requirement. You know, I'm still stunned whenever I see pictures and presentations, not at conferences, but I mean, you know, in boardrooms, at how so many executives lack confidence in the way they present, just in the way that they come across. And I think if you're apologetic about what you're selling, or you find it difficult to ask, then you know it's just a much more difficult task. And I think for it's also a cultural issue in this country. I talked about, you know, a father that worked in the Middle East. I think some nationalities and in some countries people are just a lot more upfront about asking. And I think that there's an awful lot. There's a word that hasn't been used today. I was 20 minutes late, so maybe it did. Forgive me. And that's chutzpah. It's a Yiddish word, but you know it means an awful lot here, which is, you know, just the confidence to ask. Just, you know, what's the worst that can happen? So I think we need to train it. Frankly, I think we need to train it. I think we need to recognise it. I think we need to model people who are good at it. Again, something that comes from elite sports and neurolinguistic programming. The idea of actually understanding what good looks like and then modelling it and seeing if we can channel it. And actually, some people. You know, I don't know if it's controversial to say that some people lack it to the extent that I wouldn't send them into a negotiation and they wouldn't want to be there in the first place. Sometimes I think you just, you know, you need some of those harsh realities. Maybe we're just sending the wrong people in.
Well, what I observe, if on a pitch rehearsal or pitch planning, somebody in the room's not right, the agency doesn't think twice about changing that person out. And yet they often just line up the same people for the negotiation bit. So I think you're bang on. We do need to get hot on that talent and have pricing people and in the marketing sales function in an agency who've got the confidence, who've got the capabilities to help us or to do that pricing. I mean, maybe, we know there's a lot of traffic from our industry going to clients. Maybe we should be looking to bring some of that pricing expertise from clients into our business to help us sort of get stronger muscles more quickly. Why wouldn't we? Why not? Fish outside. Sarah, you're...
No, I was just going to add that I think there's an evidence element to confidence. So if you fundamentally understand, going back to your point about how do we articulate how it works and why it has value and what we do, that there has to be more of that knowledge and helping de-risk the conversation and de-risk the investment that you are asking somebody to make by knowing, either being able to articulate and understand the challenge, knowing and understand how the behavioural elements work, knowing how what you're going to propose does, particularly, going back to David's point about the gorilla. If you want the client to buy a gorilla, that's something that you can't prove. You don't have evidence in advance for that because technically it's never been done before. If you're going in pitching Volvo, life paint, you don't have an example for that. So you need to be able to have the evidence to understand and give context to the commercial conversation that you're trying to have. The two aren't completely separate things. So for me, there's a significant element of that confidence point will come from simply knowing and understanding why and how we're effective, because that's where the value comes from in the conversation, and that's what you're negotiating on. Yeah,
absolutely. Any other questions?
Hello. I'm representing the public relations industry here today, so thank you for letting me in the door. I've done, just a couple of observations and a question for Paul. I've done quite a lot of the training on this in our business, and I've found that the PR people tend to apply it in their personal lives and not yet in the business, which is quite interesting. So I get these fabulous testimonials of how they've negotiated in a restaurant and achieved free desserts and all sorts of things. So I think observation, and I did spend a year in advertising as well at BBH, so I've got a little bit to add to this. The idea of putting in the pricing council, I'm just interested how your clients have reacted, Paul, because I think I can see us all putting these options into place, A, B and C. Yeah. How are procurement going to react to that? Where are they going to move their attack point, knowing the game is get you to the middle? And secondly, how your clients have reacted to your people pricing differently or being more confident and actually trying to do it differently. You did mention you'd had some success. I'm just interested in that.
Yeah, Chatham House rules, we obviously don't need to tell our clients we've got a pricing council set up because this is how we're operating as an agency, how we want to operate as an agency, which I think is back to the point of us trying to drive the agenda opposed to being given the agenda to deliver on, which is what everyone's talked about this morning. I think, again, confidence, the question before is a loose word, but everyone feels a lot more confident in those sort of conversations in terms of how we value ourselves, how we should price ourselves, and how we should be talking to our clients about that. So I think, the main thing is the understanding of where we're trying to get to, and we've been very inclusive with the whole agency, and we have had some success. We haven't had much pushback thus far from clients. They've probably realised that we've got a little bit better in terms of how we're structuring things, how we're positioning things, but ultimately, it's still the same end goal as to when it was 5 years ago before we had any of this in place. How we can drive the maximum value for our clients and deliver business benefit. And I think as long as they see that, the way you get there, albeit it might be on a slightly different path, I think you've got license to do that for the sake of our own business.
Any other questions?
Just coming back to David's thoughts on different value creation at different levels for clients, do you think there's benefit to us looking at our own businesses and the value service chains that we create and deconstructing those and putting them into sort of different categories, whether it be the type of outcomes we're delivering for clients in different ways, or whether it be actual services individually and then thinking about those in isolation, Or are we better placed to try and sort of wrap it all round in one big value proposition and say, let's try and hold on to as much value by putting the cheap stuff with the expensive stuff, or however that might work. And that's for the whole panel.
Oh, good one. I'd love to take it. I mean, and I'm going to be hugely provocative on it. I absolutely think we have to divide up these things. You know, we have to accept that technology has enabled the world to do certain things differently and more quickly and more economically, maybe efficiently. And we just have to accept that. That is the way of the world. You know, Adobe systems can do an awful lot of adaptation, and there's translation technology that can automate all of those things now. And I think to sort of pretend that we can still package all of that up and deliver it in an old way is just crazy. So I think I was interested in that slide where I think we have to recognise what can we do in different ways and what's the right price or a good market price for those things, and where are all of the different things and services that we create and which things are premium. And I think the sooner we embrace that there's a difference, and the sooner we package up our pricing and our options in multiple different ways, I think the richer and the better we'll all be for it. Because I think that's what procurement get really cross with us about when we're trying to kind of bundle it or to make something more complicated than it necessarily needs to. And I think that's where I'm amazed that this industry, which is so creative, isn't ready to kind of recreate its own self, really, and to live in the past. So I'm an absolute big advocate of how do we package it all up or embrace what you can do differently, recognise it, and maybe be the first person to go back to that client procurement person or marketing team and say, do you know, we've invested in some new technology and we found a better way to do something, which actually means we're going to take the price down. Because one hopes, if the relationship's right, that might free money up for them to invest in some of that magic over here. I mean, the cynical bit of me says, do too many of our people in our agencies all want to do gorillas? And the reality is our clients do want gorillas, but actually 80% of the time they want other stuff too. So have we got the right balance of skills and aspiration in our community? I mean, Sarah, what do you think? I mean, that's a real talent question, this one.
It is, but I mean, I think it comes down to knowing exactly what role each of your clients play within your overall portfolio, which, you know, is absolutely kind of David's point. And, you know, there will be some clients that, you know, bring a disproportionate reputational benefit, but actually make you no money at all, and that's fine. But you're going to apply a different level of sort of talent and investment to them. And I think unless you know that, then it's very hard to kind of, you know, run your business knowingly and sort of commercially as well. And I think, absolutely, I mean, this is all very much a cultural thing and a behavioural thing, and I think it's about trying to get all of the sort of the key people in the business thinking about how to deliver the best for our clients every day, but also what are the new and different ways we can do it. And that can be packaging things up, it can be smarter ways of working, and it can be smarter ways certainly of going back and you know, presenting our proposition and the value we create. And I think, you know, it is all interlinked, and I don't think we can't do it without effectiveness at our core. And I think that's sort of the central point of all of this as well. We all have to start knowing and celebrating kind of what successes we're having, and they can be very small successes, they can be, you know, massive ones in terms of sort of 10 years of growth for clients. But, you know, we need to get everybody talking the language of that every day, I think.
Marc, do you have sort of different services packaged up in different ways in your business, with different people focused in moving work through differently?
We do, and I think almost inevitably could do more. And I think one of the things that strikes me about our industry, which I'm very passionate about, is it's quite conservative, and that the forces of technology that are, you know, blowing huge winds through, particularly, you know, media and our clients' worlds, have only just begun to affect us. I think the next decade or two, the disruption will be unrecognisable. Interestingly, I saw a prospectus for a startup that's trying to raise money at the moment, and it has as its objective the removal of the bottom 50%, that's 50, of the value creation of creative agencies. And of course I wanted to read it because, you know, that's they're after me and other people in this room too. Now, whether this particular startup will cut it, I could name 5 others who are after exactly the same thing. So I think understanding our value propositions, understanding our value chains, figuring out how we construct them, deconstruct them and package them is essential. But also it's back to the kind of reimagining our product, understanding, you know, where we want to focus.
I was humbled, and it took me back to my client life at Cannes when I was attending a particular talk, and I won't name the company, and I'll try to make even the category or sector a bit vague. But this particular CMO happened to mention what their profit margin per seat was. And everybody in the room took a gasp, an intake of breath. Because he made the point that they could tell you all of the cost points in the whole supply value chain, and that their profit margin per seat was €5. And it just reminded me of commercial client life, when agencies talk about millions and hundreds and tens of thousands of things. And this person was able to say our profit margin per seat is €5. So making sure money is spent and worked effectively and is returning the investment is really critical to us. That's not to say I don't value creativity. He really did. But it reawakened my kind of understanding of the rigour required to slice and dice the whole supply and marketing value chain in a way that clients do and have to embrace. I think we've probably got time for one more question, because I know some of our panel have got to shoot off ahead of lunch. Is there one more question? Dan.
Hi, I think my question is on defining value. So we've worked with Tim, we have a pricing council in New York. It's been transformational about making the agency feel more commercial. The biggest nugget, the biggest question it has is, how do you define the value of what you do as an agency? Yeah, and not in terms of I win effectiveness awards. When I'm speaking to a specific client on a specific product, how can I define the value of what I'm offering? And even to a further extent, if I look at a website, which Tim does, and go, what does it say about me? So my question is, what do we do as an industry to actually increase our skill sets in agencies around putting some teeth and some structure around what is value, how do we define it, not just on this is what my agency does, but on an individual project, on an individual client in a life cycle?
It's a good question. I'm just going to add on to that question. Having defined it, Sarah, this is coming your way, how do we then measure it, report on it, and keep our clients abreast of that value?
A couple of people have made this point about perspective, actually, whether it's through kind of negotiation or framing or whatever. And actually, if we try and justify and articulate our value in terms of what we do and what we want in the negotiation, effectively, David made the point earlier with the kind of the triangle and the Mexican kind of standoff. We're not going to get anywhere. We need to get much, much better at not focusing on the awards entry kind of categorization. What does success and growth mean for the client? And that's how we have to articulate our value. It's all about that profitable brand growth. And what are we contributing to that? That's the only value that's important. How we get there, execution, activation, key performance indicators, exactly to your point about the difference between performance and results, are all just kind of points that you make in the argument that get you to the point of what as a result, how have we transformed your business? How have we increased your profit? How have we, what did that do or deliver? What was the behavioural change that you wanted us to trigger? What was the action, the perception shift and the behavioural change? And what did that incur for you? And what did that create in terms of profit, sales, etc.? That's the only thing that matters. All of the other points, yes, we need to get better at being able to articulate all of that, but it is all about what we did for the client's business, not how many units, likes, favourites, views. They're irrelevant, because it all comes back to what did the client want to do, what was the problem they wanted to solve, and quite often, how did we help them translate and understand that it was a different problem than the one that they said they wanted to solve, and then what did we do? That's the only thing that matters.
I think it goes... Go on.
Yes. Yeah, it goes back to the point I was making before. The real challenge that we have then is how you do that over a time frame. So if you're arguing that profitable brand growth might occur over 12 months to 2 years to 3 years, how from an agency perspective do we make the argument to ourselves that we're not going to capture all of that value for 3 years? We can't do that. We need to pay people. We've got bills to pay up until that point. How do we get that difference? And also, crucially, what do we do when it doesn't work? do we give money back? You know, there's some of that around that you know, is going to take a lot more discussions like this to kind of get our teeth into, and nobody has the answer. But I think the fact that we're sitting here discussing it is a massive.
And I don't think there's one answer either. I mean, you've got to just have frank discussions, I think, with all parties, back to my point of procurement, marketing and CEOs, because unless you have the same people in the room, you're never going to get agreement and then work from there. But there will never be a single, I can't see it ever being the same for one as another. No. And again, that's just adding from a media perspective, complexity of pricing, let alone our industry, which clients are already looking at us to sort of say, can you take that complexity away from us? So, but I think like that, back to Tim's scope of value workshop, which that might have been you actually, if you work with the board.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested to talk to you afterwards.
But I also think, just to add as well, that we also have to include the fact that a lot of us work public sector, third sector. Profit's not, you know, it might be helping people adopt the workplace pension, stopping smoking, behavioural change in communities. There are a number of different ways of looking at it. And as you say, all of those are an individual basis. You have to kind of, different kind of version.
I think, though, we have to be very careful, because I feel the language is going back internal. And for me, pricing is no more than a tool. I think, you know, for me, what was really interesting in Tim's piece this year was this opening up of value. You know, value is in the eye of the beholder. I thought the whole diamond ring thing was really fascinating too. We have to get better at visioning and understanding and thinking about what the value is of what we're going to do, or what we're proposing to do, will have for the client, which does mean we need to get a bit more comfortable with blue skying, maybe, or listing out our assumptions, so that we can then articulate our price in a context of what the value and the benefit to the client may be. And I think we don't go there enough. I think consultants are very good at going there and forcing themselves to say, how do we demonstrate 10 times more value to the client, even though some of that, I'm not saying it's entirely made up, but they define the assumptions that they make, which is a bit like options. It means the client could say, oh no, you got that one wrong, but actually I like the nature of it, but the numbers are just a bit wrong. You know, if we were to start trying to define value, even if 50% of it's wrong, I think we'd be a lot further forward at trying to work out what we should value and set our ultimate prices at, rather than working inside out. Anyway, I think we're 10 past 1. I think hopefully, Paul, I've hit your deadline. You've got or Mark's got a call to make, a procurement call. Good luck with that. I mean, I'd just like to wrap up and obviously thank everybody, the speakers, our panellists, for all of you for coming today. Please just remind you all, there have been a number of pamphlets and publications that we've launched today. Pick up the pricing guide. If your agency hasn't participated in the commercial survey, please do. You can still go online, participate in that survey, and then you'll get some feedback one-to-one from the IPA in terms of how your agency performed relative to the norms that we're seeing, or the behaviours in the best performing agencies. We will be publishing some of those results. And obviously you heard some of them this morning. A lot of the material from today will be available, as we did last year, on the IPA website, in short little video films, so that you can reuse some of this material, hopefully in the training and developing of your staff. But I think, for me, my kind of one-liner at the end is, I think it falls on all of us. This starts with us, which means you. Keith really, for me, made that absolutely clear. If we want to make a difference, you all need to do something different. We need to have swagger about commerciality, be excited by it, want to make a commercial difference to our business. And I loved this phrase. I've written too many notes. I've got to find it. I'd love to be walk in your slipstream. And I found myself thinking, you know, that's something I'm going to keep in my head. Am I walking the talk? Is how that looks. Because if I'm not, and my behaviour is sending different messages, then we're not real about this. So our job is to create a commercial culture in our businesses that's as sexy and as exciting as the culture of creativity, because we need clearly that too if we're to be commercially successful. So thank you all. Lunch is outside, so we'll be around for another hour or so, but thank you all for coming, and thank our speakers.